All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this week's Ronin seminar. As punishment to you guys for no one signing up, I'm going to talk this week. This is the approximately the 6th anniversary of the formal founding of Ronin. So I thought now would be a good time to maybe lay down just a little discussion of what Ronin is all about. I'm hoping it will tie in well with the really nice talk that Arika gave a couple of weeks ago, where she talked about the independent scholarship survey that we did that heavily featured responses from Ronin Institute research scholars. And whereas that was a more statistical presentation, this will be more sort of talking about some of the philosophical underpinnings, the rationale behind some of the decisions that have been made in the past. And then when we finish up, we can hopefully just segue into a discussion of what we want this thing to become in the future. And I thought, in contrast to the way we normally do it, so I'll do the presentation, and I thought normally we sort of go right into a free-form discussion. I thought I would start with maybe a slightly more formal question and answer thing, since this will be informational about the Institute, so that perhaps at least part of that question and answer period, if there were anything that's really useful that comes up, that can be added to the video. And then we can go full on chaos. Okay, so I'll get going. All right, as I mentioned, Ronin Institute was founded formally in February of 2012, about 6 years ago. This is what I looked like then. A couple of years later, I look like this. And of course, if you know me, you'll know that this is what I look like now. And I'll tell you just, sort of the personal perspective on this. When I first sort of thought of starting this, it was motivated partly by the fact that I had become sort of spoiled. I had been very lucky and had a 3-year postdoc at the Harvard Society of Fellows, which basically all you have to do is, have meals 3 times a week with other people who do interesting things in all sorts of different fields. And then I spent 6 years at the Santa Fe Institute, where you are sort of enmeshed with, physicists and linguists and anthropologists. And the idea of going and joining a biology department seemed really confining. I also found that while I was at Santa Fe that I chafed very much against any sort of bureaucracy, but I am realistic enough to know that the Santa Fe Institute is far less bureaucratic than pretty much any university system. So I thought, oh boy, in a regular university, I'm going to be very unhappy with the bureaucracy. So I thought, I'll start up a little thing, and reached out to Stephen Orzak, who is here in the audience today, who a number of years before had started a thing called the Fresh Pond Research Institute. And he has been working successfully out of that for a very long time. And he was very generous with his time and knowledge and helping get Ronin set up. But honestly, at the beginning, my initial vision was, I want to sort of hang out my shingle. I want to basically be a freelance academic, but I'll create an institutional structure that will allow me to more easily, say, interface with funding agencies and journals and that sort of thing. But then an interesting thing happened. I was going along, I was writing about this on my blog, and people started emailing me and saying, oh, hey, can I get involved in that? That seems like something that I've been looking for. And I was not really, I think, aware at the time of the depth and breadth of people out there who are smart and passionate and committed, but are sort of aced out of academia for a whole host of different reasons. Over time, one of the things I sort of learned from both talking to people and sort of looking around is, even in just the United States, there are tens of thousands of underemployed PhDs. So people who went and got a doctorate in something and then are doing some sort of job. Often they're gainfully employed, very happy, but not really making use of that training, that expertise that they got. And in some ways, again, I think probably a lot of those people are perfectly happy. I think some people finish graduate school and they say, all right, that was fun, but that's enough of that. I'm going to go do something else now. And that's great. But I also think there are a lot of people out there who, you finish a PhD and you are probably, there's probably some narrow topic about which you know more than any other human being has ever known in history. And which is really sort of an extraordinary thing. And for the people who continue to have sort of a passion and a commitment to that topic, it is a real shame for them to feel like they are not able to continue to contribute to that field. It's a shame for them from a personal fulfillment perspective, but it's also a shame for us as a society that we have this expertise and we're sort of letting it go to waste. And the model, sort of the analogy that I thought about at the time a lot was the SETI at Home project, which you may remember nowadays, and you may have seen the the article that we posted a link to that was on Science Friday, whereas right now the phrase would always be, right, like Uber, but for scholars. But at the time, I thought it was this SETI at Home, right, which was one of the first projects where they said, well, look, what do we have? We have all these people all over the place who have these home computers that are mostly sitting idle. And so they set up a system where basically you could allow your computer's idle time to contribute to the SETI project, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And that there was something like that. What we have is all this sort of intellectual power all around the world sort of sitting idle. And how do we as a society, as a culture, tap into that and make use of it? When we first started, there were a total of 5 research scholars. Now there's more than 150. And as I think many of you who have come here today know, we have the weekly chats, we now have the seminar series, we had our unconference, we are going to hopefully be doing more of those in the near future. We're doing grants management. So the mission has really grown, and very much like the story I was telling about the original founding, we've tried to sort of let it grow in accordance with the needs. We don't have so much a vision of this is what all these people need to do, more that it is, trying to get a sense of what is it that people feel like they need in order to, do what they want to do what they need to do to feel intellectually and personally fulfilled. And then are there ways that the Institute can contribute to those things? So I thought, and some of this will be, I'm sure, familiar to some of you, but I would do a quick overview of some of the background of Ronin and the values and the ideas behind it, and some of the rationale behind those. One, of course, is the name Ronin, as I think probably most of you know. Comes from, it's a masterless samurai from feudal Japan. So in this sort of feudal era, at least the legend goes, I think these things are always, I don't know enough to know how realistic this was in actual historical times. That the story was that if you were a samurai or you were pledged to a master, and if something happened, if your master died or if your master kicked you out, you were supposed to commit suicide. And that sort of really struck me as being analogous to the system that we tend to have in academia. We have this idea that if you are not employed at a university as a tenure track faculty member or research scientist or something like that, that you are essentially supposed to commit academic suicide, that you're not allowed to participate. But so the Ronin would be the ones who said, no, I'm not going to do that. I have my skills and I have all my swords and whatnot, and I'm going to go on, I'm going to go out and make a living. And so some made a living as things like hired swords or bodyguards or whatever. Some of you, Ronin has come into popular culture in various mechanisms. There is a Robert De Niro film featuring Jean Reno, who I've been told by every time I've been to China, multiple people have told me that I look just like him. I don't know what that's about. There's a graphic novel by Frank Miller. There is a just egregious piece of filmmaking featuring Keanu Reeves. If you have never seen that, I encourage you not to. My personal introduction to it comes from Usagi Yojimbo, which is just an extraordinary series of comics by this guy Stan Sakai, who basically tells a lot of old sort of feudal era Japanese stories, old tales, but where this is Miyamoto Usagi, who is a rabbit Ronin who goes around and metes out justice and is generally awesome. Again, those of you who have read the welcome packet will recognize some of this. We sort of when to have, again, part of the idea of making something that's not super bureaucratic, but you do need to have values, and sort of the idea is that you want to really hold the sort of principles and philosophy at the center. And so we really have two, I would say, cardinal values that override everything else. One is commitment to truth, because that is fundamentally what scholarship is. It's discovery and communication of truths. And we're going to dig a little bit more into each of these in just a minute. The other is empathy. And this is, I think, one that tends to be getting eroded in institutional settings and in society more generally. But a recognition that scholarship is done by people, and those people are not identical to their work. Beyond that, commitment to a very flat hierarchy. As you know, there is only one title at Ronin, research scholar. Minimal bureaucracy. A lot of what we're trying to do is built around participation and inclusion. Again, it's about saying you don't have to be, say, at a university in order to participate in the intellectual discourse of your field. What you have to be is someone who is willing to come and work and make a good faith effort to contribute. Flexibility, individual autonomy, and accountability. That there is no one model of what it means to be a scholar. And I don't think anyone should be dictating to other people how they should be organizing their lives, or how they should be prioritizing their time or their goals. What we want is for individuals to set their own goals and values, and then see if we can sort of support this whole diversity of approaches to scholarship and life. Sort of focusing on people having institutional or individual reputations rather than an institutional reputation. And I'll say a little more what I mean about that in a few minutes. But one of the things, and this is not by any means a requirement, you don't have to be pursuing a wacky idea, but certainly we want to be a place that is supportive of high risk, sort of outside the box thinking. And of course, finally, this is one of the things that came up most in that survey, is the idea of building a community. All right, so to dig in just a little deeper, truth, what do we mean? Well, there's truth in several contexts. Discovering truths, communicating those truths, being open and transparent, but with the caveat that when we say truth, all of us probably have a sort of a picture of what we mean in our minds, and most of us probably have different pictures from each other. So truth and discovery, what do we mean? Basically, that comes down to, if you're doing scholarship, you are asking questions in good faith. Now, there's the trivial part of that, things like don't make up your results. The slightly less trivial part, which is trying to separate the pursuit of truth from sort of personal considerations, advancement of career, or accumulation of prestige. And that, of course, ties into the things that are sort of the subtle distortions of truth that tend to plague a lot of academia. systems of confirmation bias, p-hacking, these sort of failures of reproducibility that we've seen brought up in a lot of different fields. Basically, at some level, that comes down to the fact that we're doing some sort of research, some sort of scholarship, but we are invested in what the answer is. And so often unconsciously, we sort of tilt things in that direction because we hope that answer A is true, and so we resist evidence that says that answer B is true. And so, of course, this comes down to an openness to being wrong, even or maybe especially about a belief or a working hypothesis that you have been holding on to for years. So this obviously ties in with the risk thing, right? Very much in favor of people taking on high-risk projects, but at the same time, it needs to be in the context of, and and if it turns out I'm clearly wrong about that, I'm going to go in a different direction. Great Daniel Dennett quote from his Intuition Pumps book. The chief trick to making good mistakes is not to hide them, especially not from yourself. Instead of turning away in denial when you make a mistake, you should become a connoisseur of your own mistakes, turning them over in your mind as if they were works of art, which in a way they are. Communication, again, honest presentation of results and context. The trivial part of it, don't lie. Also pretty trivial and sort of well-worn within traditional academic circles. Don't plagiarize. This is one of the only things that will lose you a tenured position. But then again, there are subtler versions of ways to be untruthful in the communication of your scholarship that are important to be aware of and careful about. Giving appropriate credit to prior work. Not overselling the generality of your results or underselling the caveats. And this is one of the places where in the context of traditional academia and the pressure on the sort of measurement of everything, the pressure to get lots of citations, to pump out a lot of things in order to get more grants, advance your career, that sort of thing. All of the sort of market and social pressures within the traditional academic system now basically push you to slightly undersell the contributions of other people and prior researchers in order to just make your work a little more novel, a little more innovative. They also create pressure to oversell the generality of what you're talking about, to maybe sort of not really draw attention to the caveats, the possible limitations. But I think that is one of the core parts of good scholarship is, in some ways, I feel like every paper that's written, a big part of the discussion section should focus on, here's why I might be wrong. I spent time looking up quotes last couple of days, as you can probably tell. This is a quote from this dude, Benjamin Jowett, who lived quite some time ago. The way to get things done is not to mind who gets the credit. Transparency, openness. So this is something I personally view as not quite on the same level as the others, because there are trade-offs that come in, right? But certainly one of the things that we want to strongly encourage within Ronin is openness. Generally, publishing, open access when possible, sharing results, sharing data, posting reprints, making your work as broadly and easily available as you can. And that includes sort of the under the hood stuff, right? The methodological things. Now, the caveat with this, and where I view this as not being quite at the same level as the others, is that there can be various considerations that counterbalance this. And this depends very much on what your specific goals are. And so, for instance, if you are a happily independent scholar, you have, say, a part-time job doing something else, you're not necessarily looking for lots of grant money, and what you want to do is you want to get your work out there, then I would say absolutely, you should be fighting to just get your stuff out in as public and open way as you can. Some people, their goal is to eventually move back into a traditional faculty position, and the reality of the world may be that they need to publish in a certain subset of journals in order to do that. Many journals now have open access options, but they may cost thousands of dollars to publish open access. And so, there may be certain contexts in which publishing a paywalled paper is your best option in terms of your own goals. And so I would strongly encourage everyone to consider this aspect of scholarship and strive towards openness and making your work available whenever you can possibly do it. But there may be contexts in which it's very hard. So this multiple truths point that I was making is basically, and this is really important because we are a very interdisciplinary community, what a truth or a finding or a fact or a result looks like in, say, physics is very different from what it looks like in sociology, say. And that's just something to keep in mind, because one of the things that you often do see within academic culture is this sort of tribalism and disparaging of other fields because, they don't even do math or whatever. But basically to keep in mind, right, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Fundamentally what scholarship is modeling. And when George Box made this statement, he's specifically talking about statistical models, but it's equally true of models, if you're doing literary analysis or you're doing historical analysis. When Christina Markman gave her talk a few weeks ago about perceptions of Lithuanians during the Baltic Crusades, right? She is bringing together various sources, and she is presenting, sort of assembling a model of a particular sequence of historical events that obviously discards a lot of individual things that happen in much the same way that we do in biological modeling or modeling in physics or anything. And so the thing that you get at the end, the model, right, this sort of quote unquote truth, is going to look very different depending on the complexity and nature of the system, the resolution of the analysis, the type of data that's available, and importantly, the type of question that is being asked. And this, again, is something that tends to be very different in different fields. It's not just that people use different tools. They tend to ask different types of questions. And so just sort of keeping that in mind, that there's not necessarily a right answer to the right way to ask a question or the right question to ask. And again, one of the goals is to empower individual researchers to identify and ask the questions that they think are the most compelling ones. And that sort of segues us into empathy. When I'm saying, be aware of that, what I'm saying is we want to make sure the community sort of everyone is approaching each other with empathy. But more generally, right, one of the motivations of Ronin is the fact that people are more than their jobs, right? And for most people, I think particularly if you are, well, certainly in the US, and I suspect in a lot of other countries, among sort of middle class type folks, you may know, right, that if you're at, say, a cocktail party, the first thing that happens in every conversation you have is people say, "What do you do?" And you tell them what your job is. And that's because we are sort of deeply embedded in a culture in which your profession is closely tied with your identity, that everything else is sort of subordinate to that. And that is very, very true in academia. Traditional academic jobs tend to be very all-encompassing. And so I'd like to just push back against that I think there are people out there for whom their job is their sole passion. They're perfectly happy for their entire identity to be this sort of line of work that I pursue. But I honestly think that most people are very multifaceted. They have various things going on in their lives. They may have family, or they may have hobbies, or they have multiple interests, or they may have, involvement in various activities within their community. And that is excellent, but it is not something that tends to be well supported in traditional academia. And so one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do over the last 6 years is have a lot of conversations with a lot of people who have left academia for a variety of reasons. And of course, the canonical explanation of why someone would leave academia, at least within academia, is basically the quality of their work. It's because they're not good enough, or they're not hardworking enough, or they're just not committed enough to make it. And it's this sort of myth of meritocracy within the academic job market, that the fact that there's this really hyper-competitive job market means that only the very best of the best will wind up in academic positions. And certainly there is some amount of meritocracy in the academic job market. There are, on average, the people who wind up with high-quality professorships, I would say, are perhaps smarter and harder working than the people who don't. But at least in my observation, that correlation is really, really noisy. There are certain features that I think people who do well in academia also tend to share. They tend to be people who are politically savvy in a particular way. They are people who are willing to not rock the boat too much, particularly at least when they're going through the tenure process. And they are people who, by and large, are either just have been protected from, I don't want to oversell this, protected from hardship would be the overselling way to do it. But so what do I mean by that? Right, when I talk to people who have left academia, right, some of them it's because they couldn't take the politics, or they couldn't do this or that. But a lot of them it's because maybe they have other things going on in their lives. So, for instance, family obligations. The fact is, if you want to make it as a traditional academic, one of the things you have to do is essentially be willing to do a national or even international job search. Meaning you have to be willing and able to move wherever the job is. So people who have either two-body problem, they've got a spouse who also has geographical constraints on their job, or they have other family obligations. Maybe they are the primary caregiver for an elderly parent, something like that. Means that the academic job market may be very, very hard for them to manage, even if they are just as good as someone else. Illness is one of the things, one of the weird things with academia is it tends to be very hard to recover from disruptions in your career track. So people who have some sort of an illness, often that can throw off their career, and it can be very hard to get back into the stream. This is also a place where there's an intersection with various other socioeconomic factors. People who have wealthier families are more likely to be able to be supported through some sort of a temporary hardship, whereas if you are, say, from an impoverished family, if you have a temporary hardship, it may make it, say, impossible to finish grad school. Age is another one. Talked to a lot of people who, say, went back and got their PhD in their 50s. And although, at least in the US, age discrimination is technically illegal, the fact is very few departments are going to tend to be reluctant to hire a newly minted PhD of age 55. And the fact is, the sort of not making waves type of thing, the keeping your head down and nodding politely as the senior faculty say and do egregious things so that you can get tenure, tends to be something that one is more willing to do at the age of 25 than at the age of 55. And then, of course, there's the fact that there are academic fads, right? That certain topics come in and out of fashion. So you may happen to be someone who works on something that just isn't something people are hiring for right now. So approaching this from this sort of empathy point of view, the point is, right, these are all features of people being people. And the tendency in the sort of bureaucratized, corporatized academic context is to say, well, we need to get the most value out of the person we can. Yes, obviously this, the person who, doesn't have any other family obligations or illnesses or other constraints on their time or other interests outside of working to make sure they maximize how much grant money they bring into our department is your best hire. But if you approach it as how do we treat people as people and try and find ways for them to maximize their own fulfillment, then you need to recognize all of these things. We need to find a space for people who, whatever else is going on, if part of what they want to do is contribute to an intellectual field, they should be able to do that. And of course, the other aspect of empathy, Wheaton's law, which you'll recognize from the welcome packet, which is don't be a dick. Basically, we hope people interact with mutual respect, support. Basically, we want people to be nice to each other. And recognize that, again, in the context of an interdisciplinary institution, interdisciplinary interactions, like any sort of interaction where you're interacting with people who are not exactly like you, requires patience and persistence. And remembering that we can have different goals and priorities, yet all participate in a common community of mutual support. In particular, it's important to not assume a zero-sum game where none exists. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, so I want to just talk very briefly about this concept of rivalrous and non-rivalrous goods. So that distinction, what it means is a rivalrous good is something where if I own it, you can't own it, right? So, a house. If I own this house, someone else doesn't own the house. Non-rivalrous goods are things that are not subject to that constraint. So typically things like information, right? So if I know the best restaurant in town and I share that with you, you now know the best restaurant in town and I still also know it. Now you may be familiar, right? My examples here are we've got, say music. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the crisis that the music industry went through. And the crisis fundamentally is about the fact that, records and CDs are rivalrous goods, whereas music at some level is inherently a non-rivalrous good, the actual music itself. And our sort of capitalist system is, without making any statements about fairness or unfairness, it is reasonably efficient at allocating rivalrous goods. It is not very good at dealing with non-rivalrous goods. And so that's why for a long time, the music industry, basically, the two were coupled, right? The only way to get the non-rivalrous thing, the music, was to purchase the rivalrous thing. And so then it's easy then to create a system that rewards people for creating music and that sort of thing. Once you have digital downloads, then all of a sudden there's this crisis, and that's why we have all these, efforts to put in digital rights management things, because our system is not actually that good at figuring out how to allocate non-rivalrous goods. And we are also not very used to thinking about them, when we tend to approach everything as if it is a rivalrous good. So I think this is something that's really worth thinking about in terms of just interactions with people. So for instance, tenure track jobs, that's sort of a rivalrous good. There are a fixed number of tenure track jobs. If someone gets this one, someone else doesn't get it. But The analogous non-rivalrous good is doing scholarship, right? If you do more scholarship, that does not impact my ability to do my own scholarship. In certain contexts, funding, right? There may be a certain pot of money that is limited. And so that's sort of a rivalrous good. But participation in scholarship is not. And honestly, I think that while, funding can be important, and for certain types of research, it can be critical, for most research, about 90% of what we need is our own intellect and time to use it. Attention and prestige can be sort of rivalrous, right? That if there's only one, going to be only one super famous physicist, then, there's this tendency to compete for that attention and prestige. But success and individual fulfillment is not rivalrous. And so what we want to do is make sure we are focusing on, I guess what I'm saying is the tendency can be to think of the non-rivalrous goods as rivalrous and to withhold sort of support and respect from other people because we feel like, oh, if this person is successful, then it will make me less successful. But being really careful that a lot of times that's just simply not true. One of the other principles is a commitment to minimum viable bureaucracy. And what do we mean by that? Well, basically not having any more structure than we need. And I want to keep in mind a couple of things. One, bureaucracies tend toward expansion. So what you want to do is sort of apply a constant counter pressure. So if you've ever worked with say a chemical hood, right? You know that, right, what they do is you have a fan and it's always drawing air in through the opening. And the idea is you've got something in there that you don't want getting out. So if you just sort of leave it neutral, some of that's going to sort of diffuse and float out into the room, and that will be bad. So what you have to do is have this constant pressure going through to make sure it doesn't escape. So I sort of tend to approach bureaucracy that way, that is the knee-jerk response is less is good, with the understanding that sometimes you're going to need something. There's also an institutional ratchet effect that happens. Once you add something, it can be very hard to get rid of. So again, this means it's very important to be very cautious about adding things. Only add features or mechanisms when absolutely necessary, and always ask why or what happens if we don't, right? So there are a lot of things that will come up where, it's easy to say, boy, it seems like it'd be really convenient or sort of cool if we had this. And you can very easily sort of build up a lot of cruft that way. And so being very thoughtful about, all right, but what happens if we don't do that? What's the actual difference? What's the specific scenario we're looking at? And the other thing is that bureaucracies sort of develop immune systems. And what I mean by that is, right, once you have, say, someone in a bureaucracy doing a particular job, now all of a sudden they are invested in that job. They're invested in that job being very important, continuing to exist. And I don't mean this as a criticism of the individual person, right? This is really a system problem, right? Again, tied in with the fact that, a job is someone's identity, and it's also their source of income and their source of healthcare, probably. And so what you have is, someone who's doing this job, if it later turns out that job is just fundamentally not necessary, it can be very, very difficult to eliminate that task because there's a person whose livelihood and identity depends on their doing it. So one of the things that we've talked about for dealing with this is the principle we call everybody drives a truck. And this is really closely tied with the empathy idea. So this comes from this thing that UPS used to do back in, I want to say, the 80s, where they had a policy that everybody who worked for the company one day a year had to go out and drive a delivery van all the way up to the CEO. And the rationale behind it was that delivering packages is the core of the mission. And therefore, everybody needs to have a hands-on, tangible experience with that core mission. And personally, I think that's the way that a good way to both prevent the accumulation of unnecessary bureaucracy and an appreciation of the necessary bureaucracy. So what we aim for is that, not ever having something where there would be, somebody who is in charge of doing, all of this sort of task, but have everybody sort of pitch in together. So that everyone is sort of continually connected to the core mission, but also that the pieces of bureaucracy that are necessary are things that people understand and sort of, like I say, appreciate. So one thing that does is it means if all of a sudden a piece of bureaucracy becomes unnecessary, you're not ruining anyone's life by ceasing to do it. But the other thing that you see, and you can see this, I think, in universities, is when you have a real separation of labor between the sort of researchers on the one hand and the bureaucrats on the other hand, is you start to get a breakdown of empathy. And you start to get, the researchers look down on the bureaucrats and the bureaucrats look down on the researchers, because neither of them has a genuine appreciation of what the other is contributing to what's going on. One of the other issues, obviously, this is gatekeeping, and this relates to the participation. And of course, at some level, the core idea of Ronin is that a faculty position is not necessary for one to do scholarship. Now, you may also know, right, we don't actually require a PhD or other terminal degree. Now, that's not to say I don't love grad school. I personally think everybody should get a PhD. It can be excellent training, depending on your advisor and your program, but it is neither necessary nor sufficient for the practice of high quality scholarship. One thing to think about is, what are the systems where gatekeeping is sort of fully implemented? Because part of the issue is that it's really not in scholarship. And a couple of examples of places where there is sort of a gatekeeping that happens, there's the Bar Association, the AMA. Right? If you're a doctor or a lawyer, there are these exams that you have to pass to participate, and there are mechanisms by which you can basically be removed if you violate certain norms. So you can be disbarred if you violate something. And so the gatekeeping systems, they tend to function as a guarantee of quality. Right? So the idea is if there is a lawyer out there and they haven't yet been disbarred, then in principle, you can trust them to be a good lawyer. I think other than in a handful of very extreme cases, we tend not to have that in academia. And I'm not convinced that the gatekeeping function that is played by either the PhD or by faculty positions is any sort of a guarantee that, yes, you can trust the work that comes out of this person. Individual autonomy and accountability. Again, we do not impose requirements in terms of productivity or money. You don't have to publish X number of papers per year, because we're definitely committed to the idea that each of us defines our own goals in terms of our own success. Right? So whatever it is that you want to pursue, we want to help you get it. We've talked some about fractional scholarship, this idea that, there's nothing wrong with a model where you say, you know what, I want to do this and this. Maybe I want to spend time with my kids. Maybe I want to have this other thing that I do, and I want to spend 15 hours a week doing scholarship. If there's a way that we can make that happen, that is excellent. Also, things like different modes of publication. If you are not aiming at eventually getting back into academia, say, and you want to publish all of your research in vlog form, excellent. That is great. Reputation. One of the things we want to avoid is worrying about the trap of worrying about institutional reputation, right? The use of, like counting citations with the idea of, right, Ronin really needs to pump up its number of citations per year. Because I think that can create a lot of pathological behaviors. And one of the questions that comes up periodically with Ronin is, well, if we don't have sort of a vetting process of that sort, an institutional reputation, and if this person is not at a university, how do we know if their work is any good? And of course, the answer is you read the work. And I think we just have to sort of really commit to that, this idea that if you really need to evaluate someone, because the thing is, most of the time when someone wants to evaluate someone but doesn't want to or is not able to put in the hard work of digging through their research to understand it, they don't typically need to really evaluate them. Like if it's, should I respect this person in a social context or not? Well, you should, because they're a person. It shouldn't matter whether or not they're academic of a certain standard. Basically, we want to avoid making decisions based on a fear of, oh, well, what will people think of this? And I was thinking of this SMBC comic. Tying in with that, risk. Academia has tended to become relatively risk averse because of the dynamics of funding. There is a strong pressure towards something where you can sort of guarantee incremental results, even though often we talk about we really need to fund high risk research. The problem is that risk means the possibility of failure, and so fundamentally, if you want to support risk, it means you need to say, I am okay with 90% of whatever failing. And sort of related to this, right, prospectively, it can often be hard to tell, the unappreciated genius from the crackpot. I think at some level, the cost of supporting and facilitating the work of that one, the one unheralded genius is that you support the work of 99 crackpots along the way. To put it sort of in the most cheekily, ideas can basically be categorized two ways. There are the ideas that are probably wrong, and there are the ideas that are certainly boring. And also to remember that when we sort of look back on history, we tend to eliminate the false starts and weird ideas, and we tend to rewrite history as sort of a intellectual history as a linear progression. And of course, the great example of this is Isaac Newton, who's famous for inventing calculus, unless you're from a German-speaking place in which he's famous for co-inventing calculus and Newtonian physics and all this, right? But he also had spent most of his time doing sort of weird alchemical stuff and occult studies and all this stuff that we don't really talk about because it's partly, he's part of our narrative of increasing rationality and march towards progress. All right, and finally, of course, community. One of the things about independent scholarship is it can be somewhat isolating. And that means, we want to have sort of provide opportunity for social community, but also intellectual community, right? One of the things about being at a university is you're surrounded by other people, typically who share a lot of your interests and passions, and you at least have access to conversations to, you will, if you're going into a department every day, you will probably passively, stay up to date on what are the hot trends in the field. And so for people who are, sort of slaving away more in isolation, it's really important to proactively forge those bonds. And I'm hoping that with, the seminars and the chats and various things that we are starting to do that. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of the payoff of that, in that you start to see the twinklings of some interesting cross-disciplinary collaborations that I'm not sure would have come up otherwise. All right, now in the last few minutes, I just wanted to run through my exegesis of the logo, because I want to make sure that you guys appreciate just how deeply nerdy this logo is. So break it down. As you may know, our motto is Scantium Consequamus, which is Latin for let's chop up some knowledge, meant to be, said like, yo, let's chop up some knowledge. So that's sort of the appropriate pronunciation of that. The crossed swords relate to the fact that, right, the sort of Ronin tradition, your samurai, you would have two swords. Typically, one was a long one and one was a short one, but so this is aesthetic license on that. And hatchet to Christina Kilgrove, who is one of the 5 original Ronin research scholars who came up with the Latin translation for us. The rings, the circle and stuff is partly sort of a generic, seal shape. With the little stars are meant to be sort of fractal. If you sort of zoom in on, if you got business cards, you'll note that the fractal doesn't show up so much at that level of resolution. The numbers at the bottom are the founding date on the Mayan calendar. If you count them, there are 42 stars around the edge, because of course that is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. The squiggles around the side are from the traditional Golic Vulcan phrase, Vavunaya Svaterlishar, which is the idea of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And then the shield, we got 4 things here. We got the atom, which is, for one, sort of a generic sciencey sort of thing. But also specifically, that is the element promethium. Prometheus being the Titan who stole fire and gave it to humans, because I think part of our mission here is we're trying to take knowledge and democratize it, take it out of the ivory tower of academia. In the upper right is the Chinese character Di, which means truth, in the sense of sort of truth and meaning and significance. The Sanskrit in the lower left also means truth, but more in the sense of reality. So I feel like and I'm hoping other people who know more can help me with this, but the idea was that, again, truth is inherently multifaceted, and there are different aspects of what we mean by truth. So part of it is that what you have to strive for is both, truth, like understanding the nature of reality, but also contextualizing that, understanding the meaning or the significance of it. And then in the lower right-hand corner is a pattern that comes from West African culture, name of which I've forgotten off the top of my head right now, that goes into woven tapestries. That means he who does not know can know from learning. So there's our logo. And then just to leave you with this, in conclusion, right, our goal fundamentally is to try to bring scholarship back closer to the essential core, right, the real meaning of it, stripping away all the distorting effects of the sort of competition, career considerations, greed and ambition and the tribalism that colors so much of what we're doing. This is a quote that I often think of in this context. It's from Galway Kinnell's book-length poem, The Book of Nightmares. I long for the mantle of the great wanderers who lighted their steps by the lamp of pure hunger and pure thirst, and whichever way they lurched was the way.